All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Champlain Valley Petal meeting. I think most of you probably know me at this point, but in case you don't, I'm Mike Bastow, and I'm one of the tree fruit specialists on the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program with Cornell Cooperative Extension. I will be your host for the afternoon. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. If it's been a little while since you've been on Zoom, I do ask that just to start out through the meeting that you do keep yourself muted. To do that, you'll be able to hover over the bottom of your screen and you should find the little microphone icon. You can mute yourself for the first portion of the meeting, just so it's a little bit less distracting to us. That would be greatly appreciated. We also ask that you keep your video off as well. It's a bit distracting for us, so if you can turn that off, that would be appreciated as well. If you do have questions throughout the meeting for myself or Terrence, you can go ahead and type those into the chat box and we'll get those answered for you. We also have a pretty small group here today. So once Terrence is done presenting, I would also invite anybody to unmute themselves and ask questions directly to him at that point. So one of the beauties of having a slightly smaller group with us today. So I think that is the main housekeeping part of that. So I would like to go ahead and just say that this meeting and all of our thinning meetings is sponsored by Valent, and we greatly appreciate their support for these meetings. And so next I'm going to go ahead and just mute people, so no offense, just because I do hear some dogs barking in the background. So I will just go through what I've been seeing throughout the Champlain Valley. I was able to get out and do a couple tours through some of the orchards this morning and this afternoon, just to show what I've been seeing in my neck of the woods. So not surprisingly, phenology has been fairly spread out by variety. We had a pretty cool start to bloom, and then things started to heat up a bit later on. So I think that stretched things out a little bit. Generally, I would say I thought full bloom on Max in Peru was right around the 13th. Maybe a day or two earlier or later, depending on where you are. Honeycrisp were a little bit later, maybe around the 15th from my vantage point here. When we look at our pollination weather, I think we've had some good days and started again a little bit on the cool and rainy side, a little bit of cloudy, but near to the end of last week and over the weekend, we had some good sunny days. So I saw the bees working quite a bit on Friday, doing some bee counts for different projects. So I'm hopeful that we've had good pollination weather throughout the bloom period. There is the question of cold damage, so that was on my mind as I was walking around the orchards this morning, keeping an eye out for that. And Terrence is going to present that on some of his slides in a little bit. But I do just want to give a little bit of what I initially saw today. I looked at a couple of different varieties, Honeycrisp, Gala, New York 1, and some of the MAC types, so the main ones that I was looking at, really reflective of what we tend to have the most acreage up here. So generally, it seemed to me from the blocks that I looked at that Honeycrisp tended to have the least amount of damage. Generally, I could find some king damage here and there, but for the most part, still a lot of healthy laterals throughout a lot of the plantings that I looked at today. Sort of next in line were Gala and New York 1. I saw a little bit more injury there. Generally, a larger number of kings were missing, or if the kings weren't missing from that April event, some of them did blossom, but I am seeing today particularly some yellowing of those flowers. So I am concerned that they're going to be falling off. But even with that, I think there's still a lot of laterals in our Snapdragon this year. Then as we get further down the list, our MAC types, I thought they were hit a bit harder. So looking at some Macs, some McCowns, Cortlands, there I saw a number of kings missing, also a certain degree of laterals missing as well. So I think to kind of sum that up, this really is going to be one of those years because of that variability, things kind of varying orchard to orchard, variety to variety. Before we do make these big thinning decisions, this is going to be a year where we do want to get out and take a close look at things before we go too heavy with the thinner. But for the most part, I do think overall there are still a lot of laterals out there and there is still some thinning to be done. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Terrence.
Hang on just a minute, guys. See if I can...
And I might need to give you permission to share still, Terrence? Nope, you should be good.
How's that look, Mike?
Looks good. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back here talking about thinning, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. And you can leave the meeting with some greater confidence on what you should be doing to help yourself this year. I'd like to just point out that this is a second step in precision chemical thinning. We should have already sprayed some blossom thinning sprays, either ATS at bloom or NAA or NAD at bloom. Now we're talking about these petal fall sprays, which typically we like to apply between 110 and 130 degree days after bloom. And we'll talk a little bit about when that is for the Peru area. I'd like to give just a short summary of my observations. So how this year has gone. Green tip was earlier than normal, early April for the Champlain Valley. But temperatures after that between green tip and pink were relatively cool. So we didn't progress really fast through that green tip to pink period. Temperatures since pink have not been high, no days in the 80s, but 60s and 70s. And that's resulted in a relatively slow bloom development. I guesstimate there's about 7-day long bloom period. Unfortunately, we had this frost on April 25th and 26th, somewhere between 1/4 inch green and tight cluster, that did result in some damage to king flowers and some damage to lateral flowers. Now, bloom, in my opinion, what Mike shared with me was good in most blocks. Now, full bloom ranged all the way from May 8th to May 15th in that period of week period. And there tended to be fairly good bee activity near the end of that, which I think has given us relatively good sets. Hang on just a minute. So next, I'd like to discuss this data that Mike collected today, which is a little bit concerning, showing a tremendous variability in the amount of damage on king flowers and lateral flowers. I've assembled his data by variety. So let's start first with Honeycrisp. Most of the blocks, as he said, had very little king flower damage. However, one of them had 80% king flower damage. There were still a number of good laterals in those clusters. Kings that were there were between 4 and 5 to 6 millimeters in diameter. The laterals were significantly smaller, which should give good thinning at this time period. I like to see the kings up around the 5 to 6 millimeter before you put on your petal fall thinner. But my point is, there's a lot of variability, even within Honeycrisp, which came through the frost the best. I would point out, the Honeycrisp really has the potential to set an excellent crop of great size on the laterals, even if a lot of the kings are gone. But where you lose 80% of the kings, it makes us take a little bit of caution in the thinning process. But if you look at all the other varieties I've highlighted in blue, those that had more than 50% damage to the kings. So a couple of New York 1 blocks, most of the Mac blocks, Cortland, McCowan, Gala, which is surprising, and Fuji. If you look at that 1 Fuji block, number of live kings or king damage was high, a number of live laterals was either 0 to 3. So that would be a place for extreme caution. I have sort of a general rule in my mind. It's just based on my gut feeling that whenever damage to kings is greater than 50%, that suggests caution in thinning. And that's why I've highlighted all these blocks in blue that he estimated had more than 50% damage. This argues that you should really look carefully. Now, in talking with Mike, this all came from the Peru area. lower lying areas had more damage, certainly, but Peru is relatively flat. He didn't seem to see a lot of correlation between the lake sites and the more inland sites. So I think it argues that you really have to get out and look at your block, because I would suggest that you treat, for example, a New York 1 block with 90% damage to kings differently than a New York 1 block that had only 40 or 50% damage to kings. So this table is both encouraging and discouraging, but I hope that it will help you sort of think about the different kinds of situations within your own farm that you could face. However, I still feel like the petal fall spray is really an essential component of a good thinning program. For Honeycrisp, without a petal fall program, you tend to get much more biennial bearing. So to help ensure next year's crop, certainly that variety needs a petal fall spray. Other varieties that are biennial, like McCowan, have to have a petal fall spray, and Fuji. On blocks where there seems to be little frost damage, and I would say those are the blocks that I categorize as having less 50% or less damage to kings, I would suggest full rates, which I'll suggest what they are in just a minute. Now we're looking at, over the next several days, daytime temperatures in the mid-80s. It's quite a departure from what we've had up until now. Equally important are nighttime temperatures that will be in the 60s. Those high nighttime temperatures are often associated with aggressive thinning. Now, to counteract that, we have relatively high light levels predicted. If we had cloudy weather, those kind of temperatures would give us a lot of thinning, but with good light levels, it counteracts it a bit. So I still expect it to be good thinning, but not dangerous thinning. Now, the weather, if you put it all together in the carbohydrate model, shows a significant carbohydrate deficit, which will give good petal fall thinning, but not an extreme deficit. Here's the chart for the Peru area. It's actually the Florence weather station for today, showing the kinds of carbohydrate balance we've had since green tip. The blue line at the top is 0. So this shows that up until now, we've just been negative. We've had a deficit all the way from green tip. Now we expect that the deficits prior to up to full bloom, from green tip to full bloom, are just the result of the tree not having enough leaf area and having to develop based on its reserves. But about full bloom, where you see the vertical blue line, we expect the tree to transition to having enough leaf area that it supports itself on the daily amount of carbohydrate. And for some reason, and this is some nice data that Alan Laxo showed, the tree just quits drawing on reserves, even if it has it. So in the period we're in now, the tree is really depending on what it produces each day to support itself and its fruit. So there's this week-long period between full bloom and petal fall, and then now we are in this window starting today that we call the petal fall thinning window. During this period, at least as far as it's projected, and looking at the daily deficits, we're in a moderately significant deficit period of around minus 30 grams of carbon a day. Now, I'm predicting that as you go forward the next few days, it will be lesser of a carbohydrate deficit. It'll go closer back to 0. But during the period of time that I'm going to suggest that you thin, we'll have a deficit. Now, I want to emphasize this is good. Scary deficits are minus 50, minus 60. Here, we've been through 2 days of minus 35-ish. And now we're going back up to somewhere around minus 25. So those are not scary deficits to me. Those are good deficits to help with thinning. So what I'd suggest is that you wait another couple of days until fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters before applying petal fall thinning sprays. I was a little surprised at Mike's measurements that they're still in the 4 to 5. I'd like them to be in the 5 to 6. We'll get there by the end of the day tomorrow or Wednesday. If you look at the degree day calculator in the carbohydrate model, it shows that we're entering this window between 100 degree days and 125 that we suggest for petal fall thinning, that we entered the window today, and it will last through Wednesday of this week. So rain is always a problem, finding no windy days and so forth. But nevertheless, it looks to me like we should hedge our bets a little bit and wait until fruits get a little bit bigger, closer to the Wednesday time period, and maybe even Thursday, before putting on our petal fall sprays. I don't suggest that you jump the gun this year because of the heat. Now, my tips for successfully managing this variability from the frost is to assess each block for flower damage. Now, if most kings are present, meaning that 50% or more are present, I suggest using the full rate. And the carbohydrate model will suggest that. But where you have extensive king damage, where you've got more than 50% king damage, I suggest using slightly lower rates, somewhere about 25 to 30% lower. There may be blocks, maybe that Fuji block, where there's enough king and lateral damage that you shouldn't even thin right now. You should wait until the fruits get to be 10 to 12 millimeters, then do some counts on how many fruits are still on the tree, and then we can make a decision on thinning then. But for most other situations, I think you've got to put on a thinner now. Now, for best results at the petal fall spray, you need to nozzle your sprayer so that only 1/3 of the output goes to the bottom half of the tree and 2/3 goes to the top half of the tree. I want to comment about surfactants. Last year, I introduced a rule that Regulate is known to increase the response of NNA. And in years where there's no carbohydrate deficit, I suggest you add Regulate to an NAA7 mix at petal fall. But in years with a good carbohydrate deficit, like this year, I suggest do not use Regulate in any of your thinning sprays at the petal fall timing. Now, we'll relook at this when we get to the 10 to 12 millimeter timing, and then we can utilize one of those two rules again. I like the carbohydrate model to help us decide when to spray, because right now, looking at the deficits, the daily deficits for today and tomorrow, and then even Wednesday is still quite negative, but it shows that Thursday and Friday the deficits won't be as bad. Therefore, we can adjust our timing. Instead of going today or tomorrow, we put it off till Wednesday or Thursday. Certainly remember that in a year where we have a -60, don't spray at all, wait it out. Now, there may be some of you out there already wanting to skip this petal fall spray, but I want to encourage you to go forward. We know that at petal fall, all thinners, whether it's NaN7, MaxLN7, or even Exceed, they have a more moderate effect than they do at the 12 millimeter stage. Now, this came from a 17-year study where we compared the response of petal fall versus 12 millimeter. And at 12 millimeter, the tree is just much more sensitive to the thinners. But at this stage, between 5 and 6 millimeter fruit size, they're not that sensitive, and thus it's very safe. There's very little risk of over thinning. But the frost has already done some substantial thinning, and that's where I wish that you would look at the situation on your trees to decide whether the frost did enough thinning to wait till the 12 millimeter timing. But in most cases, I'm guessing you need to thin now. Remember that the model is predicting a significant but not scary deficit, which will be great for good thinning. Now, for most varieties grown in the North Country, Max and New York 1, New York 2, and McCallans, I would use a full dose of NaN7, or alternatively NADN7, which works equally well at petal fall, in blocks where the set looks good and you have more than 50% of the kings alive. I do caution that in most cases, we don't like to put 7 on Cortlands. They also had more damage than almost any other variety. So just some NAA on the Cortlands would probably be enough. However, for those of you growing Gala in the North Country and a few of you growing Fuji, Maxell and 7 is the preferred thinning combination. If you use NaN7, you tend to get pygmies with Fuji, and you tend to not get the best fruit size with Gala. This year, with temperatures in the 70s and mid 80s, depending on whether you spray Wednesday or Thursday, there's going to be a good response from Maxell. And so this is one of the best years to use Maxell and 7. Now, alternatively, something you might consider is instead of putting 7 with Maxell, put Exceed with Maxell. Now, this is based on some data we had last year in one of our trials. So I'm going to show you that data from last year. These were Petal Fall sprays on Gala in 2023 at Geneva. Don't read the words yet. Just look at the chart on the right top. This was a carbohydrate model, and the vertical blue line is when we sprayed the Petal Fall spray. And you can see that it was in a period of no deficit carbohydrate surpluses, and it was followed by a huge carbohydrate surplus. When you look at the table, those Gala trees had at harvest with no thinner 650 apples. They should have had 170 apples. So it was just way too many. 289% fruit set, meaning essentially 3 fruits in every cluster. NaN7, the thing that we would normally suggest, we added regulate, like the rule I just suggested, it did nothing. When we tested Exceed by itself with just regulate, also nothing. When we tested Exceed and Na and regulate, it seemed almost nothing. We didn't get any thinning. Now I'm going to skip number 5, the highlighted, because that was the only thing that worked, and just compare it to number 6. When we did ACC or Exceed and 7 and regulate, we got no thinning. But Maxell and ACC, this treatment number 5, did give us thinning. And so fruit set there was reduced to about 2 fruits per cluster instead of 3 fruits per cluster. Now that was important last year because later at the 12 millimeter timing, we didn't get any thinning either. And so growers who used what we traditionally say an NaN7 or even Maxell and 7 just didn't get any thinning from that year with no deficit. But we did get excellent thinning when we used ACC and Maxell. Thus, if you read the words now, Exceed is a very interesting product because it's like ethanol, because in the plant, it's metabolized to produce ethylene. But in contrast to ethanol, it is metabolized with enzymes, an enzyme step to produce ethylene. Whereas ethanol, when you put it on, it just massively produces a huge dose of ethylene. Now, we've known for many years that ethylene will thin. And in some countries, particularly Australia, they've liked using ethanol as a thinner. To me, in New York, it's always been like unpredictable and could be a massive overthinning. So I've never recommended it. But now Exceed comes along and it gives us some ethylene, but in a more measured dose because you have this enzyme step. So when you have high temperatures, it doesn't give you this massive overthinning. So it's very low risk even in high temperatures, but it also works in relatively low temperatures. By itself, it's a mild thinner, but when you combine it with 6-BA, as we did last year, it seemed to give one of the few treatments that gave us a decent thinning response at petal fall. Thus, you might consider putting out some ACC or Exceed and Maxell on some of your Gala blocks as a trial. I have great confidence in it, and I think you would kind of like to see its results. And so I think you should try it, and then you can have more confidence next year. Now, just to add that final comment on that, we have deficit this year. So maybe some of the other more traditional petal fall combinations of Maxell and 7 or NA and 7 will work better this year. But I still think that Maxell and ACC is a tremendous tool on hard to thin varieties like Gala. Now let me continue with just a few more comments. The rates that I give in those previous examples are all what I call tree row volume dilute basis. To convert any rate that I would say, you have to calculate tree row volume for each block and then calculate what we call the concentration factor. That is done by measuring the tree row volume per acre and then dividing that by the volume of spray you are using in your particular setup. So the example, easiest example is, let's say you had a tall spindle orchard, 3 by 12, it measured, when you measured tree row volume, the formula's in the recommends, it measured 200, but you're not carrying 200 gallons for every acre, you're spraying at 100 gallons. Therefore, 200 divided by 100 gives you a concentration factor of 2. You use that concentration factor to convert the rates that I give to rate per acre. So for example, let's say that for Honeycrisp, I suggested you spray 3 ounces of NAA per 100 dilute volume basis. You would take that 3 ounces, multiply it by 2, would give you 6 ounces, because instead of spraying 200 gallons, you're only spraying 100. So in every 100 gallons, you've got to put 6 ounces of NAA. And on a sprayer that's 500 gallons, that'd be 5 times that. So that would give you 5 times 6, it'd be 30 ounces of NAA in a tank. I want you just to keep that number in mind. Now, you may have bigger trees or smaller trees, and therefore the concentration factor would be different, but use it to then figure out how much goes in a tank. But generally, we're talking somewhere between 30 to 40 ounces of NAA in a tank. And generally with Maxell, we're talking between 3/4 of a gallon and a gallon per 100, which would be somewhere around 4 to 5 gallons per tank. Now, I generally don't like to use the concentration factor for adjusting the rates of carbaryl or 7. But if you feel like you need additional thinning, you can go ahead and double the rate of carbaryl by using the concentration factor of 2. Then the extra carbaryl, when it rains, it will reabsorb some of that and give you more thinning. But when a strong rule that I suggest is don't ever concentrate other surfactants that you might put in the mix. For example, if you put Regulate. Let me just address Regulate for a minute. There are still blooms available on the tree in the Champlain Valley and concern about fire blight with these temperatures. And so there will be many of you putting streptomycin in this spray for the petal fall thinning spray. And that works well. The questionable part is whether you put the Regulate in to help the strep be absorbed. I suggest that you not put the strep in this year if you're putting, no, sorry, that you not put the Regulate in with the strep. Just put the strep in the tank and it'll still get the fire blight control. It just won't have as much reach back as it would have if you had added Regulate. The Regulate, I think, will cause us problems with the chemical thinners because of the heat. I've shown this many times. I just show it for review. The suggested thinning strategies that I suggest for Honeycrisp and for Gala are basically a 3 or a 4 spray program. With Honeycrisp, I like ammonium thiosulfate twice during bloom, then petal fall NAA and 7, and then 12 millimeters NAA and 7 again with a slightly lower dose. A relatively high dose right now at petal fall of 4 ounces per 100. That's closer to 40 ounces in a tank. And then at the 11 to 13 millimeters, a 3/4 dose, which would be 3 ounces, which is closer to 30 ounces per tank. Now, in some years, we need more thinning, and we have to put on this rescue spray when the fruits are big. This year, I do not think we're going to need that. However, at this timing is when we need to start applying low doses of ethereal or Exceed to get return bloom on Honeycrisp. And I'll talk about that on my last slide. For Gala, I tend to like NAA at bloom or Amethyst at bloom, but then a 2 spray program of Maxell and 7. Now the petal fall, the 64 ounce rate is essentially a gallon to the acre. Alternatively, you would use this Maxell and Exceed that I mentioned. It's the same, a gallon of Maxell per acre and 400 parts per million of Exceed, which is a soluble granular, and I haven't memorized how many ounces, ounces of a pound that is, but there's a table on the label showing you how to get 400 parts per million. That's followed up by, at the 12 millimeter Maxell and 7 there, I think that was where the plant is most sensitive to Maxell and 7. You do great with that combo. If you need more thinning later with Gala, then is where I suggest Maxell 7 and oil, or probably better is just this Exceed plus Maxell, because you get the return bloom benefit of the ethylene that is produced by the Exceed. Once we get this petal fall spray on, let's say Wednesday or Thursday, it's critical to figure out how many fruits are still going to be growing on the tree and how many are falling off, because we have overlapping all of that, the frost. So we really suggest that you use the fruit growth rate model to estimate how many fruits are still growing. If you on your tree, for example, you had a target of 150 fruits, if you're relatively close to that after this spray, you could quit. But if you're still at 400 or 500 fruits still growing, then you've got to spray again at 12 millimeters. So measure the first time with a caliper at 50 degree days after your petal fall application, and then again at 120 degree days after your petal fall application, using the calipers and the fruit growth rate model that you can utilize in the MaluSim app, which you should have on your phone, or you can download it for free. Or alternatively, you can weigh 100 fruits each time using the Einhorn fruit distribution model, which we've published and it's available online also. I would offer that anybody who measures fruit diameters twice after this petal fall spray and has trouble getting the MaluSim app or the fruit distribution model to work, send me the data and I'll help interpret it and give you my suggestions on it. I end with this sort of season-long program for Honeycrisp. Now, last year we had a fairly good crop of Honeycrisp, and I understand many blocks have come back pretty well. If you by chance have a low bloom of Honeycrisp this year, you could wait to implement this to next year. But it starts with 2 sprays of ATS at full bloom, then an NaN7 now at petal fall, and then another NaN7 at the 12 millimeter stage. But then starting at 16, 17, 18 millimeter range, we start with these 4 ethereal sprays. They're about once every week. So let's assume that this ethereal spray is going to go on in early first week of June. You'd put them on each week through June. The first one has to go on at a relatively low dose because it can still cause thinning. And then once we get the fruits bigger to around 23, 24, 25 millimeters, we switch to the full dose, which is 1 pint to the acre for 3 additional sprays. This has worked extremely well to improve return bloom on Honeycrisp for 3 years at Geneva. We recommended it widely last year, and we even have more confidence in it this year to help you get consistent annual production of Honeycrisp. There's only one caveat, and that is heat. If you get temperatures in the 80s, ethereal can be explosive, and not combustible, but in terms of thinning. And so I wouldn't spray any of these ethereal sprays when temperatures are in the 80s. Temperatures in the 70s, 60s are perfect. So with that recommendation for you to think on and plan for on Honeycrisp, I'd like to end my presentation, and I'd be happy now to discuss it and consider any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Terrence. If folks do have questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the chat box or unmute yourself. I do see we had a question from Jesse, particularly when you were talking about the fruit growth rate model and taking those measurements at those set degree days. What base temperature are you using, and is that BE adjusted or just the standard one?
This is a standard degree days using 4 degrees Celsius. It's the one that the carbohydrate model will spit out. So the best way to use that is just to log on to the NUA website, run the carbohydrate model for your site. And if you put in an appropriate bloom date, it will then calculate from bloom the degree days for each day forward. So let's just assume that you sprayed your petal fall spray at 130 degree days. You would wait 50 more, and when you got around 180, you'd take your first set of measurements. And then when you got around, 100 more than that, more than the time when you sprayed your petal fall spray, you'd go in and take your second set of measurements.
All right, thank you. Does the carbohydrate model provide an estimate for other windows outside of the petal fall and the 12 millimeter? In particular, Apple Scout was asking about 29 to 33 millimeters timing.
Yeah, so it does provide an estimate for the last thinning window, which is the 16 to 20 millimeter. So I'll just back up and tell you the petal fall window is between 100 and 125 degree days. The 12 millimeter, it goes from 10 to 13, goes from 200 to 250 degree days. The last window, the 16 to 18, goes from 300 to 350 degree days. We've never defined how many degree days to get to 29 or 30 millimeters.
All right, thank you. Let's see, we have questions here. With 88 degrees forecast for Wednesday, is that too hot for NA and 7 on Honeycrisp?
So read that again to me, Mike.
Would 88 degrees on Wednesday, would you consider that too hot for an application of NAA and 7 on Honeycrisp?
No, primarily for this reason. The NAA is absorbed a lot more at high temperatures. So granted, you'll get more NAA into the leaf by spraying on a hot day. You'll also get quicker drying so that overall it balances out to just slightly more NAA in the leaf than if you sprayed at 65 degrees, where drying is slower. But the response in the plant to the NAA depends on the metabolism in the plant for the 4 successive days. So Wednesday is predicted to be warm, but then Thursday cooler, Friday cooler, and Saturday cooler. So it's the combination of all 4, maybe 5 days, all the way through Sunday, that will determine the response to NAA, not just the day of spraying. Now, if you had 5 days of 88 degrees, I would say don't spray. But if the forecast holds that we have, today, tomorrow, Wednesday hot, and then it moderates and gets cooler, I think waiting to Wednesday to spray would be the optimum time to spray. Thursday might also just be as good. But remember, by waiting to Thursday, you'll then have most of that 5 days be relatively cool and you'll get less thinning. And the carbohydrate model takes that into account. So the average that we present in that model is a 6-day average, 5 days from spraying and 1 day before. It does not show deficits in the scary range. They're all in the minus 25, minus 30, which is perfect for good thinning, even though the day of spray might have been quite a warm day.
All right, thank you, Terrence. I'll follow up. NAA for return bloom instead of ethereal. Would that be an okay substitute for Honeycrisp?
This is a controversial topic because I heard through the grapevine that Sharif from Virginia came up to your fruit school meetings and proposed an NAA program. We included that in our trials the last 3 years, and it never worked as good as either Exceed or Ethereal. I don't know the reason for the difference in his results in Virginia, but our results in New York showed that it was way inferior to Ethereal sprays on Honeycrisp. We also showed in our tests that waiting until late June to start either NAA or Ethereal sprays in New York did not work at all for Honeycrisp in the 3 years we've done that. Now we're repeating it again this year for a 4th year, but I acknowledge that he says one thing and I say a different. I only can say that what has worked for us in New York the best has been Ethereal. Now, interestingly enough, we compared Ethereal with Exceed. They both produce ethylene, but through this enzyme step, Exceed worked just as well as Ethereal and maybe less risky. Now, I thought I might have seen Greg Clark on this earlier. He's on. He'll have to plug his ears for this because they don't like me to say this. But it's currently not labeled for these later ethereal sprays. So it can be used at the 16 to 18 millimeters, but on the label, it does not allow these successive sprays. We did it in our trials and it worked great. So one strategy you might use is use Exceed first and then followed up with 3 sprays of ethereal after that. But it did not, that kind of strategy was way better than NA in our trials in New York.
All right, thank you, Terrence. Question from Jim. We'll likely be at 4 to 6 millimeters on Thursday, but anticipate that we'll still have some open flowers. How effective would an NA only program be for thinning without the addition of 7?
Probably not very effective. Now, by Thursday, we'll be going down in temperature and you'll have several days of less than 80s after that, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And so I would guess you'll get very modest thinning out of it without the 7 in it. I would say that the bloom that, you might correct me, Jim, that the bloom that's still out there is a few blooms on lateral buds on 1-year wood. And I just close my eyes and ignore that there's still a few petals out. We take the bees out and then we really need the carbaryl. Now, an alternative for you, Jim, is to take my suggestion and spray a Maxell and Exceed program instead of an NA and 7 program. But if you're going to go with an NA program, I would definitely put the 7 with it, even if there's still petals on a few lateral 1-year wood bloom.
How do you feel about an NAA and Maxell program, Terrence? I know we've used that a couple times in the past.
So we have tested that and it's worked quite well. We worked on it, especially when there were some growers working with green tomato and was that the group that did not want any carbaryl in their on their apples for the whole year. And NAA and Maxell worked quite well. I was really happy with it until I've tried this Maxell and Exceed, which I think works better.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions for Terrence? I'm not seeing any in the chat box, but please feel free to type them in or feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly. Terrence, I do have another question for you. I'm seeing more ambrosia planted in the Champlain Valley. Do you have a sense of how easy or difficult that one is to thin and any rate recommendations on that one?
Yeah, it's not as hard to thin as Gala. And it's a little harder to thin than Macintosh. So it's somewhere, I would say, like Empire. Now, Empire was always harder to thin than Max, but we didn't have any sense of how hard things were until we started planting Gala. But Ambrosia is kind of more in that Empire range. It's a relatively big fruited apple and responds well to NAA and 7. So in this particular case, I would say at Petal Fall, if you're going to wait till Thursday, I would put in the 3 ounces of NAA plus carbaryl on Ambrosia. If you were going to spray today or tomorrow, I would put only 2 ounces of NAA plus carbaryl on Ambrosia. Then I would evaluate how well that worked based on the temperatures and reapply a low dose of 5 parts, 2 ounces of NAA plus carbaryl at the 12 millimeter stage, and that'll do a really good job on ambrosia.
All right, thank you. How about Zestar? And they're asking for thinning at 12 millimeter.
So almost all the Zestars in Western New York are gone. Nobody will grow it anymore. But it's one that we've put mostly NAA and 7 on at the 5 parts or 2 ounces per 100. And we've been fairly successful with just 1 spray on Zestar at the 12 millimeter stage.
All right, thank you. All right, final call for questions, everybody. Oh, I see a few more. Can you review how to assess the evidence is of minor damage to laterals that might enhance thinning, where the lateral flower might not have been killed outright.
I look for two things. I look for the first, if the pistil is not healthy and green. Now, if you're past bloom and you're at petal fall, I cut the fruit and look for live seeds. Especially as you get closer to the 12 millimeter, you should be able to see seeds that fill the seed cavity completely. When you cut them and the seeds don't fill the seed cavity, there's a big gap between the little seed and the seed cavity. There was damage at this frost timing. The second thing I look for is the length of the stem. Short stems indicate a damage. Now, just to be open about it, I almost always find that damage on the kings, not so much on the laterals. But if the kings had a very short stem and you had some damage to the seeds, it will likely be thinned off with these thinning sprays. Whereas the first and top and the biggest lateral likely will take over and be the dominant fruit. And that's when I start cutting laterals and looking for any seeds that, if there's a full complement of seeds in there that are growing. That's hard to do at the 5 to 6 millimeter. So at this first timing, when we just got the petals off, I'm really looking at the pistil.
All right, thank you, Terrence. We did have a follow-up question. Why did New York give up on the Zestar? They must be from a different state.
Well, it just never could find a market home. It never had extremely good color. And we started coming in with early strains of Honeycrisp, and it just took away well, there was never really a good market for it because it was not a crunchy apple. It's more of a summer apple. And in the North Country, it's slightly better, a little more crunch to it. But in Western New York, in the Hudson Valley, it was not that crunchy. And you had other varieties coming in just at the same time.
We have another question coming in. We're going to be in the sweet spot of that 200 to 250 during the heat. So it sounds like they're actually pushing that 10 millimeter. Would you recommend waiting until Thursday?
Absolutely.
They're currently at 6 to 8 millimeter. And they've experienced 40% king damage and 20% lateral damage.
So in that particular case, I don't think you're at the right fruit diameter. If the model is telling you that you're already at 200-degree days, then there's a disconnect between what the fruit is doing and the model. I suggest you wait until the fruits get to the kings to 12 and the laterals to 9 to 10. That's going to be, if assuming they grow about 3/4 of a millimeter per day. If your kings are at 8 now, you got to go 4 millimeters. That's going to put you at probably 6 more days. By that time, the heat will be past. But even if you wanted to spray, I would suggest waiting until Thursday. You'll still get decent thinning. By that time, the kings will be at 9, maybe 10-ish. It's a good time. But I would wait out the heat. With the level of king damage you have, I think you've got to thin. You've still got 60% of the kings. Now just think this through with me. Let's assume you pruned pretty much on our precision recommendation and you left 50% extra laterals and you had 40% king damage. You probably still have more kings out there than you really want to keep. So even if you could thin to singles to every single cluster, you still have more fruits than what you want. Therefore, I think you've got to thin whenever you have less than 50% king damage. Now, your lateral damage is inconsequential. The ones that were damaged are probably the smallest laterals. You probably have lateral number 1 and 2 that will just be strong as the king almost.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. If anybody does have any more, feel free to type those in. I do just want to thank Terrence for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us today. Just a heads up that we will be having a 12 millimeter meeting sometime next week. That one's going to be in Plattsburgh at the Clinton County office. We're going to have a few guests joining us from the Hudson Valley Lab. We'll have Andre Santolinas and Scott Kosboom and Anna Wallace joining us for some IPM presentations and a good opportunity to meet them in person again. And we'll be Zooming Terrence in via Zoom into that meeting. So Not sure on the day yet, waiting to see how degree days shake out before planning that one, but certainly sometime next week. So I hope you all can join us there as well. And I will get this summarized later tonight and add to tomorrow's e-alert. So you'll have that summary shortly along with the recording of this video. So not seeing anything else, thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.